No matter where you stand on coronavirus, pro-vaccine or vaccine hesitant, pro-masks or anti-masks, one thing is for certain. When it comes to the pandemic, it seems those in authority do not like it at all when you ask questions about the government's mitigation policies. So the feeling from authorities always seems to be shut up and just do what you're told and don't ask questions because questions are bad. Now, how do we know that they think asking questions is bad? Because if you ask too many, you're disparaged as some like hoaxer or vaccine truther or something worse. You're censored and deplatformed. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So over the weekend, reporter Alex Berenson was permanently suspended from Twitter. He challenged some of the narratives and apparently asked questions about vaccines and mitigation policies. And he's hardly a right-winger. In fact, there are a lot of people on the right who don't trust what he says about vaccines because he's not a right-winger. He's just the former science reporter for the New York Times. Now, it should be noted that he's made a number of early observations that actually turned out to be pretty correct. For one, in fact, Berenson noticed something quite curious, that the highly vaccinated Israel, that country was regarded as the vaccination gold standard for every nation, with over 70% of their population vaccinated. Well, Berenson noticed something a little odd. Cases were suddenly rising again, despite the safe and effective vaccine and high vaccination levels. Now, not only that, but he also noticed that data showed many who were hospitalized with severe COVID in Israel, they were vaccinated. So these were breakthrough cases. And it was strange because we're always told this is a pandemic of what? The unvaccinated. So apparently that's not true in Israel. And Israel has been ahead of the rest of the world in terms of their vaccine program and rollout. Of course, this wasn't welcome news because presumably waning efficacy of the vaccine might discourage people from getting vaccinated or getting further boosters. Now, that doesn't change the fact that Berenson was right, and Israel's prime minister is saying as much now, that 2 shots will no longer suffice to protect people and they might need a third. Now, Berenson being right in the past hasn't stopped Twitter from permanently suspending him. And what got him suspended was this tweet, which questioned the effectiveness of vaccines. And it read, and I quote, "It doesn't stop infection or transmission. Don't think of it as a vaccine. Think of it at best as a therapeutic with a limited window of efficacy and terrible side effect profile that must be dosed in advance of illness. And we want to mandate it. Insanity," end quote. You know, honestly, what he said was really no different from what CDC Walensky said just like 2 weeks ago. Now, if this vaccine loses efficacy quickly and can't stop the spread or contraction of the virus and only protect against severe symptoms, that kind of sounds like a therapeutic. But when the government wants to mandate vaccinations, that is a kind of questioning that authorities do not want to hear. So Berenson's been deplatformed permanently. Now, just today, a profile piece, I did an interview with the Washington Post. And at one point, the writer, Manuel Franzia, mentioned that the virus specifically, he said it was kind of unhelpful, the way that I discussed vaccines, because I've asked questions, and he assumed that the questions were answered. So from the Washington Post piece released today, quote, "On air, she tells her listeners that she doesn't oppose vaccines, but she's contributed to an aura of mistrust by frequently referring to what she describes as unanswered questions about possible effects, menstrual cycle problems, heart inflammation, etc., most of which have been dismissed by leading health experts as exceedingly rare or unproven. Vaccine advocates have blamed misinformation, especially in right-wing media, for the lower vaccination states and red states," end quote. So I have to say that actually they discovered a lot of PhDs, and it wasn't just Republicans and MAGA hat wearers that were asking questions. But what gets me is when you ask a question, and I will always ask questions, how does asking a question contribute to an aura of mistrust? I mean, where I come from, asking a question means you want knowledge and you would like to fill your basket of knowledge that does not have the knowledge you want in there with the knowledge that you want to get when you ask a question, right? I find that my trust tends to go up when questions are answered. In fact, the very reason trust for our health agencies is at an all-time low, and make no mistake it is because questions are discouraged. You get statements like attacks on me or attacks on science, which is a bad answer. There are legitimate questions that deserve legitimate answers. I've been incredibly specific in the exact language of questions that I had that were not absolutely at all whatsoever answered. And frankly, these people, when they tell me this, they kind of come off like the Pope telling Galileo that the sun circles the earth. These days, instead of answering our questions, our health agencies like the CDC, they spend its time issuing guidance on how to talk inclusively. This is the CDC, Center for Disease Control. They tweeted, quote, "Are you using hashtag inclusive language? CDC's health equity guiding principles for inclusive communication shares preferred terms and language," end quote. We are in the middle of a pandemic, And they want to make sure that you're not saying things like incarcerated or offender, which has absolutely nothing to do. You got to look at the list. It has absolutely nothing to do with diseases that the center controls. Meanwhile, there have been huge protests around the world and mandated vaccines and vaccine passports, like this weekend in Greece. The legacy media doesn't cover it, of course, happened in Germany too. It would appear that people have questions about these very controversial vaccine mandates and policies like vax passports, and the mass protests would indicate those questions have not been sufficiently answered for millions of people. So what do? Well, if you're the government of Australia, you ban protesting and you issue fines for $3,800 per ticket. See, when it comes to COVID policy all across the world, censorship, deplatforming, banning, and sometimes arresting people with questions, that's the de facto policy. Maybe it's time more of us ask questions. And if you don't want us to ask questions, then, oh my gosh, give us the answers then.